Hi, my name is Kevin Gandy. I'm one of the pastors at Real Life LA, and it is an amazingly beautiful day here in Southern California, and so it's so good to be able to spend a few minutes with you. You see, here we are in the first week of April, which for a lot of churches around the country, this means the first weekend of the month, and you'll be taking communion together with your church. See, some churches take communion every single week, and if you're like our church, Real Life LA, we take communion on the first Sunday of the month. So chances are you might be wondering how that's going to work this Sunday, since this coming weekend is the 1st of April. So we're going to actually look at 3 questions today that you might be having in regard to communion. Number 1, why should we take communion? Number 2, am I even allowed to take communion in my home without a pastor present? And number 3, we're going to talk about how you're going to take communion this weekend at home. But the first question, why should we take communion? You see, when Jesus gathered with his disciples in John chapter 6, he actually says, I am the bread of life. Whoever believes in me will never thirst. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry. And then later in his life, Jesus actually uses the metaphor of bread and of juice as he gathers around the table with his disciples on the night before he died. And in taking some bread, he said, this is my body, which will be a sacrifice for you. And then he says, the wine, the juice will be a sacrifice, and it'll represent his blood, which will be shed on the cross. And so these images of bread and of juice or wine are symbols of what Jesus did on the cross in sacrificing his life so that we could receive eternal life. And so that's why we do the sacrament of communion, whether on a weekly basis or a monthly basis. Churches all around the world practice this as a reminder of what Jesus did on the cross. And the second question you might be asking, well, am I even allowed to take communion? You know, here we are, we're in a quarantine, I'm in my home, I'm worshiping on a screen, you know, a pastor is not in my house, can I take communion? And the answer is yes. And here's why. You see, for the first couple hundred years of the church, in the early church, the first Christians actually gathered around the table with people in their homes. You know, they didn't have fancy churches and big buildings that they went and met in. They just gathered in people's houses and they broke bread and they had a little wine and they gathered together and they said, we're going to remember what Jesus did on the cross. And so as they broke bread and as they took the wine, they remembered that sacrifice and they celebrated the resurrection together. And that's what we'll do this Sunday. As you gather in your living room with your family and as you're watching online our broadcast, we'll have a moment in our service where you'll get to actually break bread and sip of the juice or the wine together and sharing communion just like the early church did in their homes thousands of years ago. And the third question that you might have is, how do I do this? Well, if you're tuning in at our church, Real Life LA, this weekend, we will have worship, and then Pastor Jim will give a message, and then we'll come up on screen and we'll walk you through step by step as to how you can take communion in your house. So you're going to need to get a couple things this week. So you're going to need to get some bread. So go to your local grocery store and get some bread. Get that. You're going to need some juice. I've got my handy Welch's. You might get a bottle of wine, and then you're going to need a glass of some sort. And the way we'll do this on Sunday is we'll come up on screen and we'll say, all right, grab your bread. And we'll say the words of institution, which essentially is a fancy way of saying that on the night before Jesus died, he took some bread and he broke it. And he said, this is my body. Every time you eat of this, you do so in remembrance of me. And we'll hold it up and we'll say, all right, grab the bread off your table, break it, pass it around, and give everyone a piece of the bread. And then in the same way, we'll take the juice, we'll take the cup, we'll take the juice, and we'll say, then Jesus, after the supper, took some wine. He poured it out and he said, this is my blood, shed as a new covenant for the forgiveness of sins. And every time we drink of this cup, we do so in remembrance of Jesus. And we'll say, all right, grab your juice, grab your wine, grab your cup, pour it out. And then you'll take a piece of the bread and you'll just dip it into the cup. and then you'll take it together. And your family can do this together as you celebrate communion together. I know some of you might have kids at home. If you've never had a conversation with your kids about communion or what that means, check out our online resources at reallife.la/kids, and that will give you some helpful things that you can talk about with your kids if they've never taken communion before. And we're going to leave that up to you. If you don't feel like your kids are at the spot in their life where they are able to take communion, then certainly you don't have to serve them communion in your home. But we are going to leave that up to you and your family. But nonetheless, we just wanted to give you a couple things to think through about this weekend, about why we would take communion, to give you the permission to take communion, and then also allow you the opportunity to kind of see how we'll do it this weekend. If you have any questions about that, you can send us an email at info@reallife.la. We'd love to answer those, and we look forward to seeing you this Sunday.